Hello, and welcome to episode 0 of the Disputed Questions podcast. My name is Harrison, and in this very first episode, I will be introducing myself and the plan and goals for this podcast. But before I do that, 3 proverbs from Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. The first is, "The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom, and whatever you get insight." The second is, "Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gets understanding." And the last, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain understanding." I'll come back to these proverbs in a moment, but allow me to now introduce myself. As I said, my name is Harrison. I'm a philosophy student, a convert to the Catholic faith, and a committed Thomist, which just means that I'm a student of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a 13th century Dominican friar, priest, theologian, and philosopher. I'm originally from Tennessee, but I'm currently in school in California. And as of right now, at the time of recording, I'm also in effective house arrest due to COVID-19 in a house with 9 other guys from school, which is quite an adventure. But it's also a perfect time to make and record a podcast. So that's what I'm doing. I'm recording in our garage, which is for the most part probably the quietest place in the house. So hopefully this goes well. A little bit more about myself. I love all things ancient, classical, and medieval. That includes literature, art, architecture, history, music, language, etc. I'm also passionate about knowledge, learning, and seeking truth, which is a big reason why I'm a philosophy student. I've been interested in philosophy since about my freshman year of high school, though I didn't really start getting into historical philosophy until late in my senior year of high school. I love the questions which philosophy asks. I love reading about the subject, learning about it, thinking about it, writing about it, and talking about it with others. I'm also very interested in other subjects, such as theology and science, and this podcast will touch on some of these, though to a lesser extent, since philosophy is what I'm most familiar with personally. So now that you know a little about me, let's talk about the podcast. As I just mentioned, this is a philosophy, theology, and science podcast, although we may at times delve into some other areas, such as history or literature. This is also going to be primarily a text-based podcast. I'll explain what I mean by that. A podcast about philosophy, theology, etc. could take a number of different formats. It could, for instance, be an idea-based podcast, where each episode focuses on a specific idea from the history of the subject in question. So one episode might focus on Plato's theory of forms, another on St. Anselm's ontological argument, and then another on Hume's arguments against miracles, and so on. It could also, however, be a person-based podcast, where each episode focuses on a specific individual. So here you might have one episode devoted to Parmenides, one to Plotinus, one on Heidegger, etc. Or the podcast could be theme-based or history-based, and so forth. But this podcast, as I've said, is text-based. Each episode will center on a particular text, either an entire work or just a part or section of a work, depending on length and various other factors, from the history of philosophy, theology, and science. The goal is to explore the works, ideas, and arguments of the great and influential thinkers throughout human history. So one episode might concentrate on Plato's Republic, another on an article from Aquinas' Summa, and another on Locke's essay concerning human understanding. And we'll spend the episode just diving into the text, immersing ourselves in its language, context, background, its structure, intention, meaning, and its ultimate significance. The primary focus will be attempting to discover what the text itself actually says, or what it's trying to say, on its own terms. The goal here is to really understand what the work is saying and why it matters. We'll be asking questions such as, what does this text mean? What arguments is it trying to make? And are these arguments successful or convincing? And finally, what is the real value of the text and the ideas it's presenting? What influence has it had, whether positive, negative, or both? What truth can we learn from it? How can it make us better thinkers and better humans? Here, of course, my own views will necessarily supply the framework for analyzing various ideas, theories, and arguments. But as Frederick Copleston asserts in the preface to the first volume of his A History of Philosophy, that my approach will be from a, quote, definite standpoint is an advantage rather than a disadvantage, end quote. In other words, it is not only necessary but even good and beneficial that this podcast will be grounded in and approached from my own specific intellectual positions. Of course, this is predicated on the assumption that one still maintains objectivity, fairness, and charity. When I am reading and explaining a text from Plato, my aim should be to understand what Plato is saying on his terms, and not what I may want him to be saying. Excuse me. But when I analyze and evaluate Plato's ideas, I will necessarily be doing so as myself, as Harrison, the Catholic and Thomist living in the 21st century United States. Seeking truth objectively requires that one be open to the possibility of being wrong and of being corrected, but it does not require that one entirely abandon what one already does believe to be true when interacting with other ideas. This would be a subversion of truth rather than the pursuit of it. I'll speak more on this in a little bit. So, why a text-based approach rather than some other format? There would be pros and cons to any way of doing it. One pro with focusing on text is that you still get to discuss the other aspects as well, through and in relation to the texts. So if I do an episode on the Republic, I still get to discuss Plato and the theory of forms and historical aspects of ancient Greek philosophy and the problem of universals in general, and so on. And I get to do all this using an actual primary source itself. Another reason, though, is just that I personally enjoy reading the texts themselves and find them fascinating and valuable in themselves. Reading these works broadens our intellects beyond our own age and culture and intellectual framework, and can help form our mind according to good patterns and habits and intellectual virtues as we immerse ourselves in the words and worlds of the masters. It is good to go to and learn from the masters themselves, in their own words, as they have been handed down to us. At this point, allow me to refer back to the 3 proverbs which I read at the beginning of this episode. The first was, "The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom, and whatever you get insight." The second, "Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gets understanding." And the last, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight." These sayings, I think, exemplify my ideal for the heart of this podcast, of this project. The ultimate goal of the podcast as an intellectual endeavor is wisdom. And the beginning of wisdom, as the first proverb indicates, is to get wisdom, to desire it and seek it. Just to turn oneself towards wisdom is itself the start of wisdom. And so the underlying motivation of this podcast is to thus orient ourselves towards wisdom and the acquisition of wisdom. Philosophy, after all, just is the love of wisdom. But this raises at least 3 questions. What is wisdom in the first place? Why should we get or seek to get wisdom? And how will a podcast like this help in that endeavor? Let's take each question in turn. Wisdom, in essence, is knowledge of the ultimate meaning and nature and purpose of things, and of existence itself. St. Thomas writes, quote, "The consideration of the wise man aims principally at truth, not of any truth, but of that truth which is the origin and end of all truth, namely, which belongs to the first principle, whereby all things are, and the universal end of all things." End quote. Wisdom, again, is knowledge and understanding of the fundamental nature and meaning of reality and being. It is knowledge of the highest and deepest things, and so it itself is the highest and most noble kind of knowledge. St. Thomas also describes it as, quote, "the ultimate term of human knowledge," end quote. This is the first aspect of wisdom, but it has a second which flows from the first. Wisdom first knows the fundamental nature of things, and second judges and orders accordingly. So St. Thomas says, quote, "Wherefore wisdom rightly judges all things and sets them in order," end quote. And elsewhere, quote, "Wisdom denotes a certain rectitude of judgment according to the eternal law," end quote. In this sense, wisdom enables the right ordering of our actions according to what is truly good. This brings us to the second question, which is, why should we seek wisdom? And to this question we can respond with our second proverb. Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gets understanding. We should seek to get wisdom because the one who does so is truly happy, or blessed, or flourishing. Part of this happiness comes from the fact that wisdom is in itself a great good of extreme value. So the very same proverb continues, quote, "For the gain from it is better than gain from silver, and its profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called happy," end quote. And St. Thomas writes, quote, "Among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy," end quote. But part of this happiness from wisdom also comes from the fact that wisdom helps us to live and act well, which conduces to happiness. Wisdom is thus a vital component of the good life, the virtuous life, which of course we should all be earnestly striving after. And now we come to the final question we asked, which was, how exactly can a podcast like this help in our pursuit of wisdom? And here we turn also to the final proverb. "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight." This proverb enjoins listening to and learning from the teachings of our elders, which is precisely what this podcast has in mind. In focusing on the texts of the great thinkers from human history, we are, as I have said, going to the masters, to those who, if they have not gained wisdom, have at least sought it, and hence have something to teach us. If we cannot learn from their success, we can at least learn from their errors. If they cannot point out to us the right way, they can at least guard us from the false ones, which have already been trodden. In this podcast, our aim is to sit at the feet of our common human and intellectual fathers, and to listen to and soak in what they have to tell us. We are listening to the words of wisdom from her lips, her mouthpieces, her children. We are going to the founts and sources of wisdom, at least relative to natural and human knowledge. In so immersing ourselves, our hope is that the text can teach us how to think, habituate and shape, mold, form us towards good thinking. Our hope is that these texts inform us as to the right questions to ask, the right topics to be pursuing, the right ideas to be wrestling with, the right principles to be using, and the right methods to be inquiring with. Part of wisdom is knowledge of first principles, and it is the great thinkers who most often come closest to these principles, or who use them well, or make them clear and explicit. And by reading the works of these great thinkers in their own words, our hope is to absorb at least some crumb of these traits in our own lives. And, in addition to all of these things, one final reason to read these texts is just that they are really interesting, especially if you're already into philosophy or theology or science. So that hopefully gives a good idea of the aim and motivation for this podcast. As I said above, I will of course be speaking and analyzing from the framework of my own views and beliefs, specifically as a Catholic and as a Thomist. But I definitely do not want this fact to scare away potential listeners who do not share these positions. I would love for this podcast to have a wider range of listeners: Catholics and non-Catholics, Christians and non-Christians, theists and atheists, Thomists and non-Thomists, philosophers, theologians, scientists, and anyone curious about seeking truth and wisdom. One should also keep in mind that I am only a student. As such, you shouldn't think of this podcast as a series of lectures given by an expert, because I'm certainly not. Instead, think of it perhaps as an invitation to join me on my own journey in attempting to explore, learn, and interact with great ideas. I'll probably get a bunch of stuff wrong, maybe even horribly wrong, but that's just an important and necessary part of the learning process. You could also think of this podcast as something like a philosophy book club. I'll try to say before each episode what text I'll be reading, and that way listeners can read it too if they want, and can send in any questions or comments for discussion before the episode. Who knows, in some episodes I may even have special guests on to discuss a particular work. So before I finish this introductory episode, I should probably say something briefly about the name, Disputed Questions. The name comes from the disputed questions or disputations of medieval universities. This was a formal method of academic inquiry or debate or discussion. In its basic form, a disputation centered around a specific question or problem or topic about which there might be some disagreement, confusion, or dispute. Arguments for opposing sides on this question were set forth, and then a solution would be given, explained, and defended. And then finally, the opposing arguments would be responded to. Disputations took place between masters and students, either publicly or privately. One writer, Bazin, writes, quote, "A disputed question is a regular form of teaching, apprenticeship, and research, presided over by a master, characterized by a dialectical method which consists of bringing forward and examining arguments based on reason and authority, which oppose one another on a given theoretical or practical problem, and which are furnished by participants, and where the master must come to a doctrinal solution by an act of determination which confirms him in his function as a master." And this was part of the standard curriculum of medieval universities. The method has its roots in the philosophical dialogue as a genre, such as the Socratic dialogues of Plato. So Eileen Sweeney writes, quote, "Disputation arises out of, and is an academic formalization of, the philosophical dialogue," end quote. Now, as many are probably well aware, the scholastics have often been very much looked down upon and even ridiculed as philosophers and thinkers. My aim here is not to enter into a full-scale defense of medieval intellectual culture, but I will say that at least in theory, the method of the disputed question is, for me, a paradigmatic model of intellectual inquiry. And, in addition to the fact that I just love all things medieval and scholastic, and so the name Disputed Questions was a perfect fit for a podcast for me, the ideals of the disputed question also somewhat fits the themes and goals of this podcast. Disputation required engagement with various opposing views on a single position. And in this podcast, we will not be reading text from simply one school of thought, but from pretty much every school of thought. Secondly, disputation encouraged and provided opportunity for synthesis in the pursuit of truth and wisdom, the attempt to reconcile seemingly conflicting views or at least glean what is true from each. It thus provided the opportunity to learn from those with whom one disagrees. And again, that is very much a goal of this podcast. There is probably not a single text with whom most people will agree with what it says in its entirety, but this absolutely does not preclude from learning significantly from it. We will be reading from a wide variety of different sources, but the object is not to agree with what every single source says. Rather, it is to first understand what the source says, consider it, and learn from what is good and true about it. From all the various sources thus arises in our intellects an ultimate unity of synthesis. The sources are many, but wisdom and truth are one. Finally, the method of disputation required being familiar with what other great thinkers have had to say on a particular subject. Indeed, this was part of the very origins of the method. Sweeney writes, quote, "Disputation comes into the classroom as an outgrowth of the Lexio, the careful reading and commentary on authoritative texts," end quote. And this is, obviously, what this podcast is almost entirely about. So these three aspects, engaging a wide variety of different and opposing views, accepting and synthesizing truth from wherever it's found, and becoming familiar with what other great thinkers have had to say, these are all virtues of the disputed question method, which I hope this podcast can embody and exemplify. Thus, while the podcast won't be formatted in the exact style of the traditional disputed questions, its aim is to honor the great virtues and legacy of that method. So, with all of that having been said, I'm now going to wrap up this 0th episode by laying out the practical plan and outline for the podcast going forward. So I'm going to be, I think, making the podcast in a seasons format. So instead of, lost my train of thought there. Seasons. So I'm going to be releasing episodes in seasons, in each season at a time, or probably what I'll do is have each season, the episodes will be like release one episode a week or every other week, and then take a bit of a break, and then later release the next season in the same way. I'm thinking around each season, I'm thinking that each season will have around 10 episodes. That seems like a good length, but the first season, this season, is definitely going to be fewer, probably about 5 episodes this season, just because I'm just getting started, and that's easier. And this is very much an experiment for me. I've never really done anything like this before, so we'll see how it goes. Each season, the different episodes, I'll try to cover different time periods and genres and schools, especially time periods. So I might have one episode with a text from the ancient or classical period, then the next episode on a text from the medieval period, the next text on a text from the early modern period, and maybe later on in the modern era, and then maybe even a 20th century or contemporary text. So that's not definite. I can't promise that every season will follow that format, but that's a general idea of what I'll try to be going for. Like I said before, I'll also try to announce the text for each episode before that episode. So, and maybe even all the texts that I'll be covering in a season. so that people can read the text if they want and can send in any comments or questions if they have any. So with that being said, the first text for the first episode will be Aristotle's Categories. It's one of his shorter works, and one of his very important and influential works. So if you are interested, definitely skim through it, read it, send in questions and comments. A preview for the rest of the first season, like I said, the first episode will be on the categories. I'll also be doing Aquinas's On the Principles of Nature and Descartes' First Meditation. So again, that's a text from the ancient era, a text from the medieval era, and a text from the early modern era, which should hopefully give us a good range of texts and ideas and views. I say that I'll be doing like a text per episode, but a lot of the texts will be divided up for episodes. So, and some episodes, I think I've mentioned that they won't be covering like an entire text. Like Plato's Republic is huge, so I wouldn't do an entire episode on Plato's Republic, but on a section from the text. And yeah. So also another note, feel free to recommend texts. I can't promise that I will do the text that everyone recommends, but I'm definitely interested in what people might want to hear. So thank you all for listening. If you find any of this interesting, please subscribe to the podcast and share with your friends and family and coworkers and anyone. I hope that the podcast going forward will be fruitful and rewarding. And so, to end this episode, allow me to read another proverb, a verse from the Wisdom of Solomon. Wisdom is radiant and unfading, and she is easily discerned by those who love her, and is found by those who seek her. All right, until next time, thanks for listening.